Hello, everyone, and welcome to Trievr Recall Management and Mock Recalls webinar series. We created this ongoing series to educate and inform and test your industry's recall readiness from initiation, investigation, and communication. My name is Jill Frank, and I am the Marketing Director for Trievr and Mock Recalls. And today's topic covers the recent release of the FDA guidance as it relates to voluntary recalls. Here to fully break out the top takeaways is our host, Dr. Darin Detwiler, and special guest, Dr. Stephen Amato.
Well, welcome everyone. This is our first in our series of webinars about recalls. And I'm really happy to introduce my friend, professor, and collaborator, Dr. Stephen Amato. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Detwiler. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar series on such an important topic. Recalls represent not only one of the sort of technical terms that the general public understands about regulatory affairs and FDA and what they actually do, but it's also one of the chief ways that firms have the ability to correct any sorts of issues they may find with their particular products after they've received marketing approval or after they've been distributed in the case of foods.
Great. Great point. And it's amazing how many times I end up in conversations with people who either work in the food industry or who don't work in the food industry or the pharmaceutical biomedical device industry. And there's questions about what are recalls. And I'll have to explain to them that, a recall is basically when there is an issue which is in violation of laws that are administered by the FDA, and it could result in a product like that might have been produced between this date and that date, or that comes from a specific lot. It could be everything that has this label on, every product of this kind is recalled. And there are also situations where, because the recall involves an ingredient in other food products, let's say, you may have multiple food products that are recalled because of this one single ingredient. So they're not all the same. They're not all necessarily huge, and they're not all necessarily very small or only for a specific time period of production, or even where it was distributed to, right? Sometimes it's only of a product that was distributed to this region of the United States or something like that. But I think, understanding what a recall is pretty important. And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about a little bit about the FDA's recall authority, and we're going to talk about some different types of recalls. But to start off, I thought we would just point out, there are many recalls. There are many recalls for different reasons. They are not all the same. And many people remember about 25 years ago, probably the largest, most notorious pharmaceutical recall of fen-phen. This was in 1997. It was a hugely popular weight loss drug in the 1990s, and an estimated 6.5 million people took this drug to help fight obesity. But after consumers began experiencing heart disease and other pulmonary problems, not only did the FDA set a recall into motion, but more than 50,000 victims filed lawsuits against fen-phen's maker, Wyeth. And ultimately, one of the reasons why it's the most costly product liability cases in the history is because there was some $14–15 billion in awards to victims, and legal expenses took it to over $20 billion. That's a pretty big number when you look at it like that. On the food side, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Peanut Corporation of America, where salmonella contaminated peanuts that were products in other foods resulted not only in the recall of over 3,900 different types of products from multiple companies, but it resulted in the deaths of 9 people. And the CDC estimates that some 22,000 Americans became sick from this. And one thing that is part of why this is a landmark case is that the CEO he was found guilty of nearly 100, him and his brother and the QA manager and some other plant managers were found guilty of nearly 100 federal felony charges. And the CEO ended up going to federal prison for 28 years, a length of time that was rather unheard of in related to an outbreak and recall of product regulated by the FDA. Dr. Amato, do you have any thoughts of other notable cases that kind of come to your mind or that you share a great deal with your clients and students?
Yes, Dr. Detwiler, thank you for asking that. The fen-phen case is certainly one of the biggest that FDA has dealt with throughout its history, quite frankly. And, just hearing you say those numbers sort of brings back all kinds of memories because, I can remember when it happened. The one thing that recall showed is that folks in manufacturing, can be held personally liable for any harm that results to patients or consumers, even after the product receives FDA marketing approval. And so we see that a lot on the labeling side as well from an advertising promotional perspective. So in other words, a firm will be really aggressive in terms of promoting what it is that their product can do. In the case of biopharmaceuticals or devices or foods, having so much nutritional value and, and so on and so forth. So if it's found after the product reaches the market that, for example, some skips were stepped or some corners were cut or, quality assurance regulations weren't followed very closely, things weren't written down. The one thing that we've learned over the past 20 plus years, especially with respect to that case, that the fen-phen case, is that, executives can be held personally liable for the things that their firms do, because according to FDA's own rules, the establishment of a quality management system in a manufacturing organization, quality, begins and ends with management. That's a core principle of establishment of a quality management system. So, I think, to your point, that case was one of the most well-known, but it also, I think, taught us collectively some lessons with respect to, what can happen from a punitive perspective, if a firm cuts corners or doesn't follow, industry practices, while they're commercializing one of their products, regardless of whether it's a food, pharmaceutical, or device.
Well, and some of that liability issues perspective you're looking at, that can be tied to the responsible officer responsible corporate officer doctrine, which has been around since the 70s, well before the fen-phen case and other recent cases. But before we get into the more recent guidance, the FDA guidance on voluntary recalls, let's talk really briefly. Where does the FDA's recall authority actually come from?
So FDA's recall authority comes primarily from some of these two technical words here, from either cases of misbranding or adulteration. And it's very simply what that means is misbranding. You can think of it as mislabeling of a particular product, whether it be a food, nutritional value, a device with respect to what its intended use is, a pharmaceutical with respect to what its indication for use is. So that's essentially what misbranding is. Adulteration essentially is, not marketing a product with the product specifications upon which FDA approved your product to actually go to market. And so FDA's authority derives really to, from a recall perspective, it really goes all the way back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In the biopharma and device world, and later on in the food world through the Food Modernization and Safety Act, there were certain criteria put forth from a statutory perspective by the U.S. Congress with respect to how FDA would evaluate new product applications. And similarly, as you know, from the Food Safety Modernization Act, same deal. So the FDA really derives its authority to oversee recalls when it chooses to, and we're going to talk about that, I think, when we talk about the guidance. But when it chooses to, FDA has at its discretion enforcement mechanisms that are backed up by statutes. Again, not to be repetitive, but by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Well, and it's important to point out that the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FD&C Act, as it's often referred to, it's changed. It's been amended and modified over a number of years as new elements keep making themselves present. There are certain things that, when it was originally written, we just didn't have an issue with, we just didn't account for. I'd like to share my screen really quick and show you a couple of elements here. So the most often, this is from FDA recall data from 2021, the most often recalled products, we have 24%, or a kind of a catch-all. We have IV products, catheters, heart medications, cough medications, herbal supplements, and a lot of these are like 1 or 2% each. Then we have painkillers and fever reducers. Medical devices account for about 12%, injectable drugs 14%, and dietary supplements. Again, this is FDA recall data from 2021, accounted for some 42% of FDA regulated pharmaceuticals that were recalled. If we look one step further in terms of their top reasons, some of these things you already mentioned, Dr. Amato, mislabeling or incorrect labeling. We have adverse reaction, bacterial contamination, lack of sterility assurance. But when we start getting down to the lower ones, unapproved drugs, particulates presence, and containing the number one, 16% is also not only the particulates presence, but undeclared drug ingredients. So this is quite significant when we look at these different reasons why these items are recalled.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at your list, I mean, virtually all of those things can be characterized as either misbranding or adulteration, especially the last two that you mentioned, at 16%. Those are cases of adulteration of products. I mean, those are cases where, FDA is not informed with respect to, in the case of a drug, everything that's in the formulation, things that make it stable, sterile, all the things that give it a shelf life that healthcare practitioners can use when they need them. Similarly, on the food side, there may be products out there. Nutritional labels are important, as you know. There may be things in there, that somehow didn't make their way to the label. And, I can think of a very specific case that, I personally worked on during the pandemic where, a firm, not a firm, I should say, a consumer during the pandemic, and this is a whole different area, so I don't want to go into too much depth here, but, they went into a consumer store, a very large one whose name you would know if I mentioned it. But, during the pandemic, they were looking for like hand sanitizer, right? And, during that time, if we all remember, I mean, we're all in close quarters and all that other stuff, spent a lot of time at home. And so, there were cases of individuals with substance abuse problems, for example. And these hand sanitizers are supposed to, the inactivation ingredient is ethanol, but methanol is cheaper. So there were firms during that time that tried to save a couple of dollars, cut a few corners like I talked about before, and actually put methanol into their hand sanitizer. And there were actually cases of folks that, for one reason or another, they couldn't get to the liquor store was closed, whatever, so they drank the hand sanitizer. And as a result, that led to, that that led to all kinds of bad things happening. And you just mentioned product liability, so that's why I brought that up. But obviously, the presence of methanol in a hand sanitizer, which is an FDA regulated product, methanol didn't show up on the label. The label said ethanol.
Well,
so it's adulteration.
And one of our attendees in the Q&A was asking about food, and it's amazing how similar we can look at food in this situation. Some of the largest in terms of tons of products recalled or numbers of recalls themselves pertain to undeclared ingredients and labeling errors, of food. It's almost I don't want to say double, but there are more recalls and more quantities of food recalled of late due to undeclared ingredients and labeling errors than actual contaminated foods.
Yeah.
And a lot of the same situations exist with food, with the reasons for those recalls. But before we get onto the FDA guidance that just came out earlier this year, it pertains to voluntary recalls. And I think it's important for us to differentiate between voluntary and mandatory recalls. So what is the difference between mandatory and voluntary recalls?
Well, for the most part, you'll find if you segment the data that you just presented to us, right, you'll find that most of those are voluntary recalls. FDA does derive from a regulatory perspective. Now, I'm not talking about statutes, I'm talking about CFRs now. So, 21 CFR Part 7 is the relevant section that you want to look for. But much like lots of other CFRs, there's multiple parts and subparts to it, right? So one of those subparts, describes FDA's, we can talk about the guidance, but describes FDA's advised approach when you want to initiate a voluntary recall, right? A different segment of 21 CFR Part 7, a different subpart, right, gives FDA the authority to step in and actually manage the recall if it believes that, for example, in the case of a Class 1 recall, there's a very reasonable chance that there's a threat to public health out there caused by that particular product. So in those particular cases where the FDA feels like it has to step in because it's such in a particular case, it's such a threat to the public health that in their mission to promote and protect that public health, they feel like they need to step in. But as I started to say, if you break down the data that you showed before, anecdotally, probably 75% of those were handled through voluntary means. Maybe 25% FDA had to step in and either manage the recall itself, and or utilize its other enforcement mechanisms if the recall enforcement mechanism didn't work. They can do other things. They can ask the firm to withdraw the product, all the other enforcement things that FDA does. So I think that's I think that's a major difference. So really, at the end of the day, FDA as a really a consumer-driven agency gives firms the opportunity to react first. And if they don't feel like they're reacting aggressively enough, again, Class 1, et cetera, then they have the authority to step in if they so feel it's necessary.
Well, and there's, a good number of agents or NGOs and other watchdog groups that have been quite critical of the fact that perhaps there's too much emphasis on the voluntary recalls and not enough on the mandatory recalls. Even the baby formula issue and the Family Dollar recalls that took place this year were two examples of where the criticism is, why were those voluntary as opposed to mandating them earlier? And could that have been critical in terms of benefiting the consumers, like you point out? Yeah. Well, let's get into the FDA guidance here, and I'm going to bring up I'm going to bring up my screen again and share it. And so the initiation of voluntary recalls, this came out in March of this year under 21 CFR Part 7 Subpart C. It describes how firms should develop and implement implement necessary plans and procedures that specifically focus on training, planning, and record keeping to effectively plan, prepare, and initiate a voluntary recall in order to adequately protect the public from product potential violations of the FD&C Act. And this is actually minor. This is not new. This initiation of voluntary recalls is definitely not new. And it actually, this guidance makes minor changes to an April 2019 older version of the same title. So this guidance really kind of emphasizes that regulated firms must be recall ready. And specifically in terms of having recall plans and initiation procedures that are specific to not only their facility and their commodity and their business, but that even get into, and these are the three big takeaways, and I want to ask you about these in just a minute here. Training, they need to identify and assign responsibilities and properly train those individuals. Planning, which involves establishing recall communication plan, identifying potential reporting requirements, and that written recall initiation procedures, which includes ceasing distribution and shipment and sales of the affected product, developing a strategy, and promptly and timely notifying direct accounts and the public of a recalled product that that presents a health hazard. And finally, record keeping, not only adequate product coding, but they have to maintain their distribution records, which has been something that's been a roadblock to outbreak investigations and recalls in many cases. So what are your thoughts on this idea of recall ready?
Well, recall ready obviously is a very important concept. I mean, not only, you can look at it from from the firm's perspective, it makes good business sense, right? Because, this is not a perfect world. Manufacturers are not perfect. We're all human. Mistakes are sometimes made unintentionally. So it just makes good business sense to have a plan ready and canned and ready to go. If you as a firm, and you're going to know first because you're the firm, right? The FDA is not going to know first if something's gone wrong with the product. You're the first one that's going to know, unless, for example, an adverse event is reported through MedWatch or something, by a healthcare institution or by a specific consumer. But anybody that's ever looked at, the MedWatch database or the FAERS database or any of the adverse event databases knows that they're huge databases. And, the FDA does what it can to monitor those every day. But the other thing is that, one thing that you touched upon before, FDA in terms of number of employees is a finite number of employees. And they also have to establish where their priorities are. Are they submissions? Are they recalls? Are they doing other things that, FDA does, so on and so forth. So with a finite number of people, and if you go on the FDA website and you look at all the recalls that are happening, for instance, if you did that today, you'd see that there are probably 30 or 40 of them within the past month, and a lot of them had to do with food. So that's why I say oftentimes, it's the manufacturing firm itself that has first knowledge. But, from a statutory and from a regulatory perspective, the FDA, as part of the quality system documentation, mandates, and this is described in an earlier guidance that was issued in March 2020. What does a recall ready plan look like, right? So if you go back to that March 2020 guidance, which preceded the one that, the 21 Part 7 that we're going to talk about, there are some specific steps outlined for what the FDA considers recall ready. And it mentions all the things that you had in your slide before, from, making sure that people are qualified to do their jobs, making sure that, you have stuff documented during manufacturing processes, so on and so forth, making sure that where your product went, record keeping, distribution, all that other stuff. And so, all of those things are really, really important, when it comes to deciding whether or not you're recall ready. Now, of course, if you want to, document even further and take it another step further, you would do a mock recall, or you would put together a case study, for example, what happens if such and such happened, to my tomato crop, the tomatoes that I'm distributing all over the country. Maybe they got spoiled for some reason or in a certain section of the country, right? So you need to have those procedures canned and ready to go, so that when you pull the trigger, you can initiate your recall effectively, and you can conduct it efficiently, so that, with sufficient reporting to FDA, so that the FDA doesn't have to step in and mandate further things, with respect to further measures with respect to recalls.
Well, one of the great points that you just brought up in terms of being recall ready is, a lot of people think, oh, well, how did this start? Well, the FDA triggered a recall. Well, no, actually, that's not how these might start. If you look in terms of what the FDA recommends as these are the steps, the very first item is to identify a problem. Now, a problem can be identified by the maker, by the company, but in most cases, it's identified because of consumers being harmed, users, patients, people with the prescriptions becoming harmed. But being recall ready takes it back even earlier and says, look, before you're actively involved in making and distributing and selling this, you should have a plan for a recall. And I think that before you really look at, is your plan adequate? Is it effective and efficient? You have to take into consideration the likelihood and severity of the impacts, right? We have class 1, where it is likely to cause, and I'm sorry, class 1 will, literally described as will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. And I can bring up this screen as well. Class 2, it may cause temporary or medically reversible adverse health consequences. And it may be that the probability of serious adverse health consequences is remote. And class 3 is where exposure to you or use of the product is not likely to cause adverse health consequences. But we have to, again, look at the likelihood that one of these will happen and the severity behind these for those specific products. And in doing that, okay, so now we have a plan, and part of that plan is identifying our procedure, who's got what responsibilities, who's going to be trained, identifying our strategies, understanding our likelihood and severity, and our bookkeeping, making sure that our record keeping is adequate. But we can't just do that and then leave it there without making sure that it's effective through a mock recall. Have you been involved in any mock recalls or are aware of mock recalls and their role within industry? What can you share a little bit about that with us?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in addition to, I wear 2 hats. I'm a professor of regulatory affairs at Northeastern University, as is yourself. And, I also run a consulting firm called T-June17 Life Sciences, where a lot of what I do is I work with firms kind of after the fact, mostly on the medical device and in vitro diagnostics and biologic side. And what that involves is something that you just mentioned. A consumer is hurt or injured, and you have to assess the severity, does it cause hospitalization or death, by one of these products, right? And now I'm specifically talking about medical devices, and biologics. And so, excuse me, if the clinical consequences are severe enough to cause any of those things, right? Lots of times the first thing that happens is, that consumer, will work with the healthcare practitioner and they'll notify the FDA, but, they'll also sue the manufacturer. So some of what I do in my consulting work is I either work with manufacturers on the defense side or with law firms that are representing consumers on the plaintiff side, to analyze, why a certain, for example, device didn't do what it was supposed to do. And devices are used in surgery, so the potential consequences, can be more severe, but they certainly act more quickly than, for example, if you ingest a food that, might make you sick or give you food poisoning. At least you have some time there to kind of react, maybe not a lot of time, but some time to react. On the medical device side, I mean, if you're in surgery and your device malfunctions, I mean, that's an instant adverse event, probably severe in a lot of cases, depending upon, what, for example, a product defect is. And so for that reason, I mean, even though it doesn't happen as often as it does on the food side, for that reason, the consequences tend to come with higher levels of morbidity and mortality. And that's where the lawsuits come in. And
Sure.
Acting as an expert witness for both on the defense side as well as the product liability side or the plaintiff side. I've watched the recall guidance issued by FDA evolve considerably over the years, whereas to this point now we have obviously the 2022 guidance that we've been alluding to, the 2020 guidance I alluded to earlier, but before that, in terms of recall sort of guidance from FDA, I mean, there was some, but there wasn't nearly as much as there is now. So, I think we've come to a good place where, most manufacturers at least, understand what FDA's expectations are, in terms of being recall ready, as we talked about. They can gather all this information. They can make sure that product complaint files are in order. They can ensure, they know where their product has been distributed, and they have the ability to get it back to do whatever it needs to do, whether it be a correction or whatever, and react to the public health crisis.
Right. Well, before we get to some Q&A, and if you've been holding on to some questions, if you're attending live, if you're wanting to ask questions to either myself or to our guest, Dr. Stephen Amato, I want to follow up on something you mentioned there. A few years back, the FDA commissioner talked about problems with recalls and investigations in terms of manufacturers not being able to indicate where their product went. And in some cases, you have some products that are FDA regulated that you don't necessarily know where it came from. What was the distribution system? Where was it warehoused? What were these different steps involved? I think some of that comes out definitely in terms of how recall ready a company is. If you were looking at whether it is how an insurance company reacts, how a court during trial reacts, will it look negatively upon a company if they are not able to prove that they were recall ready because they never had any mock recalls?
Yeah, no question. And as you know, I mean, FDA conducts quality system audits all the time. During the pandemic, I mean, obviously were issues presented with respect to the things that we needed to do to keep ourselves safe during that time, but before that and today, I mean, FDA is almost back to full strength with respect to conducting quality audits, especially if a submission is forthcoming. And as part of that quality audit, they're going to check and see that these recall mechanisms are in place. That's a quality thing. And FDA finds during that audit that recall mechanisms aren't in place, with at least, some of the information or a lot of the information, perhaps, describing guidance already issued in place and canned, you're going to get a warning letter for that potentially, or a 483. And I'm imagining what everybody knows what those things are. But essentially, a 483 is just it's a citation. So it's more than a parking ticket, but it's less than a speeding ticket. Whereas a warning letter, and there's a certain reaction time on behalf of firms to respond to those, what we call 483 observations. And then a warning letter takes it one step further, and it basically says, if you don't do X, by in YZ timeframe, then we're going to go further with our enforcement discretion, and eventually, all the way down towards removal of the product from market.
Well, should a mock recall be seen as a healthy indicator of a company's safety culture?
No question. And I think that part of what drives that is that, you know, as you know, we've been moving over the past couple of years to a thing we call quality by design, QBD. So you're actually designing, you know, your quality procedures to be proactive, all right, so that you can look out, and even before any adverse events happen, you know, perhaps internally you're taking a certain product, you know, whether it be, you know, a device, a biologic, an in vitro diagnostic, whatever, and you're continuously sampling, let's say, for example, the manufacturing line, you know, to make sure the product specifications are what they're supposed to be. So that's an example of being proactive and integrating quality by design into your products, because, you know, at the end of the day, if you design these sort of safe measuring evaluation points into something like a manufacturing procedure, you can continually test and see whether or not you're meeting FDA's expectations, or at least the expectations upon which your product received marketing approval.
Great. Well, another one of our attendees asks a pretty relevant question here, I think. Should a voluntary recall be seen as a negative, a negative thing for a company?
That's a good question. And I would draw an analogy to the way people feel, you know, even though it's not quite the same, it happened a long time ago, that, you know, the Tylenol scare, you know, we had back in the, I think it was the 80s or somewhat. And, you know, it involved tampering, but Johnson & Johnson as a company did the right thing. I mean, within days, you know, they had all their distribution, you know, documentation, you know, worked out, and, you know, they started to withdraw the product. It's not quite the same as a recall, but they started to withdraw the product, you know, from the market. And so, you know, everybody still buys J&J products, you know, and at the time, you know, from a media-based approach, you know, they were actually lauded by many stakeholder groups, you know, for taking responsibility, number one, and then number two, you know, having recall mechanisms in place, and then three, executing on them immediately and, you know, and effectively to protect the public health. And, you know, I mean, it was a long time ago. I don't quite remember, you know, the details as to, you know, how many people were adversely affected, but basically Johnson & Johnson minimized the number of people that were potentially harmed by their Tylenol scare. So you asked whether or not a firm can be sort of negatively perceived because they initiate a recall. If it's a voluntary recall and it's done the right way, and, you know, voluntary recalls are initiated, as that guidance document shows, by the firm's first safety communication to its customers. You know, if they do it the right way, you know, it doesn't have to hurt their reputation long term. They might take a bit of a short term hit, you know, depending upon certain factors like how, you know, how often the product is used. But, you know, in the long run, I mean, virtually every major biopharmaceutical company or med device company at one time or another, you know, has experienced a recall. Not all, but a high percentage. And some of them, you know, some of them are big household names. And, you know, people continue to use their products. And, you know, a lot of that, again, depends on the factors that I just mentioned. Now, if you're irresponsible and they ignore it, you know, those tend to be the circumstances under which FDA inserts itself and says, look, we're going to give you a little bit of help. And I'm putting that nicely.
Well, I also find that the companies that it's not so much that they get in trouble because of the mislabeling or the contaminated or lack of sanitary assurance or whatever it is. It's often because of their you know, how they communicate during that outbreak. They either they blame others, they deny that it exists, they downplay it, they make statements blaming the FDA because, you know, this could potentially not be them. So sometimes it seems as if even the marketing and PR and legal team, I would venture to recommend be involved in those mock recalls in terms of how are we going to communicate with our distribution system, with our retailers, with our end users about these, and how are we not going to communicate about these
Yeah.
recalls. I believe that plays a significant impact in terms of how end users, the average citizen, perceives not only a company, but the significance of a recall.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, Dr. Detwiler. And I've seen throughout the years, my share of companies who've acted responsibly, when it comes to at least having those recall procedures in place. And I've seen companies that, got that deer in the headlights look whenever, when a consumer or a patient, whatever, was adversely affected by one of their products. And so, there's a whole range of companies out there with many sort of doing a good job, but not a great job. I mean, the other thing I think it's important to mention too is that, mock recalls are not an FDA mandate. They're a good thing to have in place, from a quality perspective. It's good to have procedures in place. And, it's important, I think, to work with a good firm, that knows its stuff, when they're helping you with a mock recall, because, many times, just from an objectivity perspective, a firm will hire an outside agency to come in and look at their stuff and do a mock recall, but they're not mandated by FDA. But like I say, that the companies that, that want to project a responsible to the consumer, type brand, they'll do these things regularly. And, just from, my history in industry, I've been involved with companies that completely ignored, essentially all equality. And, I've been with firms that, every time they do something, every time they initiate a CAPA, whether it be even a small one, they write everything down to the smallest detail. And, these are things that consumers generally tend not to see. But FDA sees them, and that's why FDA acts as, the governmental watchdog, if you will, to maintain its mission to promote and protect the public health.
Well, I'm sure that all of us and our listeners and our viewers and our live attendees here, they're aware of the fact that, the cost of compliance is far less than the cost of non-compliance. The cost of properly executing and preparing for a recall is far less than really not executing a recall well at all. But today, and this is our first in our Recall Rescue Roundtable live webinar series, we've been able to look at the role of mock recalls within the new guidance from the FDA for voluntary recalls and what that really means. And we're also able to look at not only mandatory versus voluntary recalls, but where FDA recall authority comes from, and define recalls with a look at a couple of notable recalls. And I really want to thank our guest, my friend and advisor and partner and education, Dr. Stephen Amato. Thank you very much. And I really, really can't emphasize enough how valuable your contribution to our next generation of regulatory affairs leaders is, and how much work you've done with the industry. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Detwiler. I appreciate the opportunity. And, I think that, one of the main messages or takeaways is that, even if you aren't familiar with all this technical stuff, when you hear, for example, on the news that such and such a product failed, or there was a design defect, all that other stuff, even if you don't understand any of that stuff, I think what we've talked about will educate consumers to know that, FDA has their back.
And before I hand it back over to our host for the webinar, I just want to make a statement here that we've talked about a couple of squeaky wheels, if you will. We've talked about a couple of worst case scenarios, and I'm really happy to be able to say that I've been involved in regulatory compliance for some 30 years, and for every one bad actor, if you will, there are so many companies and so many leaders and entire workforce teams within these companies that go above and beyond. They don't just get it right, they go above and beyond every time. And I really want to commend those companies that do it well, as here we are talking about a couple of examples where it didn't turn out so well. So at this time, I'm going to hand it back over to Jill Frank to take us from here.
Well, I wanted to thank you guys so much, Dr. Darin Detwiler and Stephen Amato, for being a part of our first Recall Rescue Roundtable live webinar. We're looking forward to doing one every single month. Every one of these webinars will be recorded and available to be seen on our website and all of our social channels, including LinkedIn. This will be available on the Trievr Recall Management LinkedIn page, as well as the mock recalls page. And of course, if you all have any questions regarding what we can do to help you guys as a company with regards to developing a mock recall plan and helping you execute that, please do not hesitate to contact us. And thank you all so very much.